Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into a pretty intense discussion, one that happened on the Joe Rogan Experience featuring Dave Smith and Douglas Murray.
That's right. It definitely generated a lot of buzz.
It did. And you've brought together some sources that focus heavily on Dave Smith's view of that whole exchange, specifically how he felt about Douglas Murray's arguments, or maybe lack thereof.
Exactly. We're looking at what Smith himself said afterwards, his thoughts on the JRE debate, his response to Murray's op-ed in the New York Post.
Okay.
Plus, we've got Glenn Greenwald's take, which adds another layer, and, crucially, bits from the actual JRE transcript.
Good. So we can see what they actually said. Our goal here is to unpack Smith's side of things. What were his main criticisms? What really stood out to him about Murray's performance?
Yeah, let's dive in. So, right off the bat, Smith's take was pretty clear.
Yeah.
He felt Murray wasn't there to actually, debate ideas in good faith.
What did he mean by that? Like, what was Murray doing instead, according to Smith?
Well, Smith saw it as relying heavily on appeals to authority, basically. I know better because I'm me, and getting bogged down in semantic arguments. Word games, almost.
Okay, can you give an example of that, the semantic thing?
Sure. Smith mentioned the whole discussion about whether we're at war. Smith used the term broadly, talking about geopolitical conflict, interventions, that sort of thing.
Right, like a general state of affairs.
Exactly. But he felt Murray's response was to get really specific, questioning if it was a declared war, if Smith personally was at war. Smith saw this as a way to dodge the bigger picture he was trying to paint, focusing on the definition, not the reality.
Okay, I see. And that ties into another big frustration Smith had, didn't it? The whole "you haven't been there" line.
Oh, definitely. Smith felt Murray kept coming back to that you lack expertise because you weren't physically present in, say, Ukraine or the Middle East.
And Smith thought this was just a way to avoid the actual arguments he was making.
That's precisely Smith's interpretation. He saw it as a deflection tactic. And he had some counterpoints.
Like what?
Well, the Nazi Germany analogy was a big one. He basically said, look, historians analyze World War II all the time without having lived through it. You don't need direct experience to analyze causes and effects, right?
Makes sense. You use evidence, analysis.
Right. And he also brought up Murray's own predictions about the Ukraine war. Smith suggested Murray had been there, but his early predictions turned out wrong anyway.
So presence doesn't automatically equal perfect understanding or prediction.
That was Smith's point. It challenges that specific line of argument Murray was apparently using. It's not just about being there.
And Glenn Greenwald noticed this sort of thing, too.
Yeah, Greenwald's take was quite pointed. He described Murray as acting like a Karen, basically complaining about who Rogan has on his show rather than engaging with their arguments.
So, less debate, more gatekeeping in that view.
That seems to be the gist of Greenwald's observation, aligning with Smith's feeling that Murray wasn't there to debate substance.
Okay, let's talk more about that appeal to authority criticism Smith leveled. How did that play out?
Smith really hammered this point. He felt Murray leaned heavily on his own perceived status and expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And crucially, Smith pointed out that Murray dismissed other commentators, people like Daryl Cooper or Ian Carroll, saying they weren't experts, even admitting he hadn't really listened to or read their stuff.
So dismissing them based on reputation or credentials, not the content of their arguments.
That's what Smith alleges. He highlighted Murray questioning Joe Rogan's guest choices, implying they lacked the necessary expertise.
But didn't Smith see some hypocrisy there?
Absolutely. That was a core part of Smith's critique. He pointed out that Murray himself isn't, a credentialed expert in every single topic he discusses.
Right.
Smith mentioned Murray, but also people like Bill Maher, Dave Rubin, even Konstantin Kassin, who Smith called a comedian. These are people discussing serious, complex global issues.
Often without PhDs in those specific fields.
Exactly. So Smith's point was, why is it okay for them to discuss these things, but not okay for someone like himself or Daryl Cooper if they disagree with Murray, particularly on sensitive topics?
So Smith is suggesting the expert argument is used selectively.
Yes. According to Smith, the real issue for Murray wasn't a genuine concern about qualifications across the board. He felt it was a shield, a way to shut down criticism, especially criticism of Israel, without having to engage the specific points being made.
Okay, that leads into another tactic. Smith accused Murray of using straw man arguments. Can you remind us what that is quickly?
Sure. A straw man is when you misrepresent your opponent's argument, making it weaker or simpler than it actually is, and then you attack that distorted version instead of their real point. It's easier to knock down a straw man than a real person.
Got it. So how did Smith say Murray did this?
Smith claimed Murray often argued against things Smith wasn't actually saying. For instance, the Maidan protests in Ukraine. Smith brought up alleged U.S. funding.
Okay.
But Smith felt Murray didn't address that specific claim directly. Instead, Murray argued against some, broader anti-interventionist stance that wasn't Smith's precise point in that moment.
So shifting the goalposts a bit or broadening the argument to something easier to dismiss.
That's how Smith saw it. Another example he used was Darrell Cooper's view on Churchill. Cooper made what he called a hyperbolic provocative statement, suggesting Churchill was maybe the chief villain of World War II.
Which sounds deliberately provocative.
Right. Cooper's point was apparently about Churchill's role in escalating the war. But Smith says Murray just dismissed this as a simple lie about history.
So ignoring the nuance or the intended provocation and just labeling it false.
Exactly. Smith felt Murray stripped Cooper's argument of its context and intent, making it seem like a simplistic, easily disproven claim rather than a debatable interpretation of historical responsibility.
And Murray apparently did this to Smith himself, too.
Yes, Smith pointed to Murray, claiming that Smith was holding himself out as a Middle East expert.
Which Smith denies.
Vehemently. Smith said he never claimed to be an expert, just someone offering analysis based on available information. He saw Murray's claim as another misrepresentation, a straw man designed to discredit him.
So Smith's view is that this was a pattern. Distort the opponent's view, attack the distortion.
That's the picture Smith painted. And this leads into even more serious accusations from Smith that Murray didn't just mislead, but actually made false statements. Lies, basically.
Okay, this is getting into stronger territory. What specific things did Smith call out as lies?
Well, back to the Churchill point. Smith didn't just see Murray's portrayal of Cooper's view, chief villain, as a straw man, but as fundamentally mischaracterizing Cooper's hyperbolic statement to the point of being false.
So misrepresentation bordering on falsehood, in Smith's view.
Yes. Then there was the claim about Cooper declining a debate with Andrew Roberts. Murray apparently said Cooper backed out because he didn't know enough.
And Smith says?
Smith flatly stated that's a lie. He insisted it wasn't true.
Okay. What else?
Smith also pointed out Murray calling Ian Carroll a comedian. Smith says Carroll's not a comedian, he's a political commentator. A factual error used, perhaps, to diminish Carroll's credibility.
Interesting. Any others?
A big one Smith highlighted was from Murray's New York Post op-ed after the debate. Murray claimed that no goods are being turned away from entering Gaza.
And Smith contested this.
Strongly. He said this directly contradicted public statements made by Israel's own foreign minister at the time. So a direct factual dispute there.
Wow, okay, that's a significant claim.
And perhaps the one Smith reacted to most forcefully was an insinuation Murray apparently made on Bill Maher's show.
What was that?
Murray suggested, according to Smith, that people on Rogan's show, presumably, including Smith and maybe others, were downplaying Hitler's atrocities.
Whoa.
Yeah. Smith called that a bullshit lie. He was adamant that absolutely no one on Rogan's show, himself included, had ever done anything of the sort. He found that accusation particularly egregious.
I can imagine. So for Smith, it wasn't just about dodgy arguments, but about outright falsehoods being deployed.
That's clearly a major part of his post-debate assessment. He felt Murray wasn't operating within the bounds of honest disagreement.
This brings us back to the idea of hypocrisy, which you mentioned Smith also raised. How did he see double standards in Murray's approach?
It really connects back to the expert argument. Smith found it hypocritical that Murray would criticize him for talking about topics without being, say, a tenured professor in that specific field.
Right.
When Murray himself, as Smith pointed out, speaks and writes about a huge range of issues, politics, culture, foreign policy, without necessarily holding formal academic credentials in every single one.
And Smith mentioned Murray didn't level the same criticism at others.
Yeah, he specifically mentioned Bill Maher. Maher's a comedian who talks politics constantly. Smith asked why Murray doesn't call him out for lacking expertise, in the same way he seemed to target Smith or Cooper.
So the standard seems inconsistent, according to Smith.
That's exactly Smith's argument. He felt the expertise requirement was a tool used against people Murray disagreed with, not a consistently applied principle.
Did he connect this to the Churchill-Cooper thing, too?
He did. Smith saw hypocrisy in Murray criticizing Darrell Cooper for supposedly judging Churchill based on one thing, that provocative statement.
Mm-hmm.
While, in Smith's view, Murray was doing the exact same thing to Cooper, judging his entire viewpoint based on that single, possibly hyperbolic statement without engaging the broader context of Cooper's work.
So Judging the judger by the very standard being criticized.
Pretty much. Smith felt it showed a clear bias, where the rules changed depending on whether you generally agreed with Murray or not, especially regarding Israel.
Okay, now, Murray also talked about conspiracy theories and the role of experts, right? How did Smith respond to that?
Yes, Smith noted that Murray labeled some guests on Rogan's show, perhaps implicitly including Smith or Cooper, as very conspiratorial.
And Smith's rebuttal.
Smith didn't just dismiss it. He offered a counter-argument grounded in, well, recent history. He brought up examples where the so-called expert class or mainstream consensus got things significantly wrong initially.
Such as?
The two big ones he often cites are the COVID lab leak theory, initially dismissed widely as a conspiracy theory, now considered a plausible possibility by many intelligence agencies and scientists.
Okay, and the other?
The Hunter Biden laptop story. Initially suppressed or downplayed by many media outlets and former intelligence officials as potential disinformation, but later largely verified.
So Smith's argument is that the experts aren't infallible.
Exactly. And that when the established experts fail or display bias, it creates a necessary space, maybe even a duty, for people outside that class to use critical thinking, look at the evidence themselves, and offer alternative perspectives.
He's arguing that skepticism towards official narratives isn't always conspiracy, but sometimes just rational analysis.
That seems to be his point. He suggested that maybe Murray's real issue isn't conspiracy theories per se, but rather dissenting viewpoints he disagrees with. Smith felt Murray seemed to want only approved voices, those who align with his worldview, to be platformed.
Which relates back to the expertise argument, again, controlling who gets to speak.
It all seems interconnected in Smith's analysis.
Now, what about that specific accusation Murray reportedly made that Smith presents himself as an expert but then hides behind being just a comedian when challenged?
Smith pushed back hard on that one. He completely denied ever using the "I'm just a comedian" line as a shield or an excuse to avoid defending his arguments.
So he's saying that's another misrepresentation.
Yes. He stated very clearly, multiple times in his responses, that he doesn't present himself as an academic expert. His position is that he's a commentator, an analyst, someone who thinks critically about information and shares his perspective.
Like many others in media or podcasting.
Precisely. He sees himself as engaging in public discourse, using reason and evidence, and he insists he always stands by his arguments, not deflecting with the comedian label. He saw Murray's accusation as fundamentally false and unfair.
Okay, let's bring in Glenn Greenwald's perspective again, specifically on Murray's demeanor or attitude during the debate. What did Greenwald observe?
Greenwald was pretty blunt. He perceived Murray as displaying a certain arrogance. He even speculated that Murray might rely on the sort of historical deference some Americans give to a British accent, expecting it to lend automatic authority.
Interesting observation. Anything else?
Greenwald also characterized Murray as being very defensive, seemingly unwilling to be seriously challenged or questioned. He even suggested Murray tends to avoid platforms or situations where he might face robust disagreement, mentioning Murray hadn't responded to invitations to Greenwald's own show, for example.
Implying an aversion to real adversarial debate.
That was the implication Greenwald made. And maybe the most damning observation from Greenwald, reflecting Smith's likely feelings too, was about the audience reaction.
What about it?
Greenwald described the reaction from Joe Rogan's audience towards Murray as overwhelmingly negative. He used terms like disgust and contempt, noting it was an unusually strong and widespread negative response for a JRE guest.
Wow. So the viewers, by and large, didn't react well to Murray's approach.
According to Greenwald, not at all. It suggests Smith's criticisms resonated with a significant portion of the audience watching the exchange.
So putting all these pieces together, Smith's direct responses, Greenwald's analysis, what's the overall picture Dave Smith paints of the encounter?
The picture Smith paints, based on all this, is one where Douglas Murray showed up not to debate, but to essentially shut down dissent. Smith felt Murray used evasive tactics.
Like the semantics and appeals to authority.
Exactly. And bad faith arguments like straw men, coupled with what Smith considered misleading statements and even outright lies, he saw a lack of substantive counter-arguments to his own points.
And ultimately, Smith felt he came out on top.
Oh, definitely. Smith expressed feeling that he crushed Murray, not necessarily through rhetorical skill alone, but because Murray's arguments were, in Smith's view, fundamentally weak and poorly defended. He felt the substance wasn't there on Murray's side.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Based on the sources focused on Dave Smith's perspective, his core argument is that Douglas Murray sidestepped a genuine debate.
Right. Smith contends Murray relied on tactics like pulling rank with perceived authority, getting lost in word definitions, distorting opponents' positions, making misleading claims, and applying hypocritical standards.
And Smith believes the underlying reason for all this, especially the focus on expertise, was basically a smokescreen.
Yes, Smith strongly suggests it was a way for Murray to avoid engaging directly with criticisms, particularly those concerning Israel, and that many viewers saw Murray's performance as evasive and ultimately unconvincing.
It certainly gives you a lot to think about. This whole exchange, viewed through Smith's lens, really highlights the complexities and maybe even the pitfalls of public discourse today, especially on these really charged topics.
It absolutely does. It raises big questions for anyone listening. How do we navigate these debates? How do we evaluate claims of expertise versus lived experience versus critical analysis? What's the right balance?
Yeah, and when does arguing about credentials become a way not to argue about the actual issue? It's a tough line to walk.
Definitely food for thought. And it's worth remembering we've focused here on Smith's interpretation based on the sources provided.
Absolutely. This was just scratching the surface of a long, complex conversation. We definitely encourage listeners to check out the original JRE episode, Murray's op-ed, Smith's responses, maybe Greenwald's take too, and form their own conclusions.
For sure. Thanks for digging into this one with us.
Thanks for joining the deep dive.